Hi, and welcome to Mistake Man. So, a while ago, I wanted to build a papercraft model of the ghost from Destiny. And so I looked online to see what I could find, and I wasn't really able to find something that I liked. All the models that I found just weren't what I was looking for. So, eventually, I just decided to go ahead and create my own. And I think it turned out well. After I finished designing and building this model, I wanted to make it available for others to build it as well. I've built a lot of papercraft models over the years, and most of them were just designed by other enthusiasts who made a great model and put it out there into the world and made it available for free to everyone. And so I've benefited quite a lot from other people's hard work. I wanted to pay it forward. So I'm going to make this model available to anyone who wants to build one for free. This video is the first in a series of 11 videos that are going to demonstrate how to build this model. So you can go along with me as I go through the construction of the Ghost model. If you want to download the model for yourself, there is a link in the description of this video to download a PDF that has the instructions and the parts for this model. You'll also find that same link in the description of every video in the series. So please check that out and give it a try. So during the construction process, I'm going to be referring to different parts of the ghost by certain names. In order to make sure everyone's on the same page, I'll just kind of give you an idea of what I'm going to be calling the different parts of the ghost throughout the video series. So the main ball sphere in the middle, I call the body. And this is the front of the ghost, and the front of the body has the eye, and inside the eye is the iris. That's the structure kind of back behind there's a plastic sheet here called the lens, and back behind that is the iris that has the black and the blue shape cut out. In the back of the body is the rear panel, and this is removable. Can be removable if you're planning to light the ghost. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's the rear panel in the back, and then these little structures all around the ghost, I call them nodes, and this one I'll just refer to as like the large node or the first node, and it's going to be the first one that we'll build. And there are 4 nodes that have that same structure, so the 2 on the top and the 2 on the bottom of the ghost, they have the exact same shape. And then the other 4 have the same shape as each other. I call these the side nodes, and they basically are kind of split in half by this recessed division. And then there's also a stand that goes along with it. I'll show you how to build. When we go to build the model, I want to tell you this up front. We're going to start with the body, and we're going to build it in 2 halves. It's a sphere, and we want to build the back half, and then we'll build the front half, and we'll want to keep those separate. You might have a tendency to just want to keep building the sphere all the way around and build it as a complete model, but we want to keep those separate in 2 halves because we have to also get to we have to have access to the inside of the body to add the pieces of the eye. And also there's going to be a foam ball that's inside of the body, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this model is what I would call an intermediate build. It's not exactly a beginner build, even though it's not all that difficult to build. There's not that many parts, and the parts are mostly large. They're not dealing with very many tiny parts, and there's nothing too crazy about the construction of the parts. But the reason I'm calling it intermediate rather than beginner is there are a few steps that you have to take during this process that you might not expect on a beginner model. And mainly that's going to be these nodes all have reinforcing structures inside of them, so that when you're handling the model, either after it's done or especially during construction, it reinforces these nodes so they don't collapse in on themselves. And so for those internal supports, there is a process of manually marking the back side of the parts to make sure that you place those internal supports in the correct location. And that process can be a little bit tricky to get everything just right, so that when these nodes get folded up and come together, they have the right shape. If you put those internal supports in the wrong spots, that can deform. They either are ineffective, or it can make the bodies or the nodes not have the right shape. So you've got to be extra careful during that process. And that's the only reason that I would call this an intermediate build. Everything else about it is, I think, pretty straightforward. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the materials that you're going to need in order to build this. Obviously, you're going to need some white cardstock to print the parts on. And the model is designed to be printed on 8.5 by 11 sheets, or ANSI A size sheets. If you're not new to papercraft modeling, you've probably got a cardstock that you like to use. If you're not sure, what I use is a cardstock that's 176 grams per square meter, and that's just a measure of how thick the cardstock is. In addition to white cardstock, I recommend you have a few other materials on hand for this build. One is some blue paper for getting the color of the eye. There are other ways, of course, you could color that blue. I chose to use blue paper. Or if you're actually planning to light the model, there are some other considerations you'll want to take for that, and I go over those in the video on lighting. I also recommend that you have some black cardstock. This is going to be for building the base. I just think that the base looks better when it's made out of black cardstock. Not a requirement, but it does look good. And then also use black cardstock for the iris inside of the eye. Again, there are probably other ways you could go about doing that instead of the black cardstock, but I do recommend. I think that does look good. And also recommend chipboard, which is essentially just a really thick card. You can see how thick that is, right? And this is just used in a few places inside of the Ghost for structural reinforcement, mostly inside of the base, but then also a little bit inside of the iris assembly. You'll also need some clear plastic for the what I call the lens, or sometimes I call it the window over the eye. And this can just be, you want that to just be some thin plastic, not so thin that it's will be wrinkly, but it doesn't have to be something really thick, right? So what I used, just like used packaging materials, is perfect for this kind of thing. I had some Funko Pop boxes that I was going to recycle, and before I did that, I just tore out the plastic film that goes inside of, forms a little window of the Funko Pop box. That's what I used for this. It's not super thick, but it's thick enough that it's not going to wrinkle when you put it on there, and it ends up looking good. You'll also need a foam ball. This is just a ball made of polystyrene foam, and I've just found this at a craft store. You can usually find these in the floral department. They usually have stuff like this. I'll talk more about this towards the end of the video. This is actually the first thing the next video starts with, is preparing this foam ball for use inside of the model. So right before the end of this video, I'll explain what's going on with that. And then finally, for materials, if you're planning to light the Ghost, you're of course going to need some lighting components, some LEDs, something to power them, some kind of battery, and a switch to turn the lighting circuit on and off. And there's a whole video dedicated to how I did the lighting inside of this Ghost. It was sort of a one-off prototype sort of deal, so it's not the best solution in the world. I'm sure others out there can come up with way better ways of doing it than I did. But I did make a video because I wanted to show you how I did it. And that might spark some creativity in others. As far as tools go, just your basic paper crafting tools. You're going to need some glue, of course. And you'll see me use, this is the main glue that I use throughout the build. It's just a craft glue. Specifically, this is the Aleene's clear gel tacky glue. I found that I like this for my paper models. I just keep it in a smaller bottle for convenience. But any other type of glue like that, there's other glues that this brand makes that work great. Or just any old generic Elmer's or that kind of glue. Another type of glue that you're probably going to need for this is CA glue, or cyanoacrylate, also known as super glue. And this gives you a stronger, faster bond, but it is a little more difficult to work with, and you have to be more careful with it. But you will need this specifically for the plastic parts, because the craft glue will not bond to the plastic, and so the CA glue takes care of that. You'll see in the build I also use this E6000 for one part of the Ghost. That's not necessary. If you don't have this, you don't have to worry about tracking it down. You can use either the CA glue or the craft glue will work in place of where I use this, but there was a little bit of an experiment I did during the build, and I decided to try and use that. Also, I do recommend that you have some spray adhesive, and this is useful for some of the parts that you have to cut out of the black cardstock. The recommended process and what I do during the build videos is I'll spray the adhesive on the back of the parts that I print out, and then, well, here you can see this is some scrap from one of the builds, and so I sprayed the adhesive on the back of this template and I paste it on the black cardstock. That allows me to trace and cut out the shapes, score the bend lines, and so that's going to be useful. This is a part of the stand, the base, and so that's very useful for the base, and it even came in handy for the iris. I didn't want to use it for that, as you'll see during the build videos. I didn't want to use it because it's this is messy stuff, so I avoid using it until I absolutely have to. But there are times where it's just really handy, like this. And I did end up using it for the iris as well, just because it turned out to be the right choice, since I had it. Now, you can get away if you don't have the spray adhesive and you can't track it down. You can certainly do without it. It's just harder to do because you've got to basically do essentially what I'm doing here, to use it as a template to cut out of the black cardstock. But instead of having it stick down, you have to find another way to do that, whether it's just cutting it out and then using masking tape or something to hold it in place while you trace or draw with a pencil. I'm sure you can figure something out if you don't have access to the spray adhesive. All right, of course, another indispensable tool is the sharp hobby knife. You'll also want a scoring tool, something to help you start the bend lines, and it makes for a cleaner, sharper bend. I use this tool, which is kind of like a little pick. This came with a yarn project loom that I got years and years ago, and I just found it so useful for all sorts of things that I use it all the time. But I realize this is a bit of an odd thing that not everyone's going to have. So instead of something like that, you could use a dedicated scoring tool like this, where it's just got a ball on the end. And this one's got even a smaller, it's got two different sizes on each end. And essentially that just helps you put it along the paper, run it along your bend line. So something like that could work. Or if you don't have something like that, you could use a dull needle or a ballpoint pen that is out of ink, right? You don't want a fresh one that's going to leave a line across your model. But if you've got one that's run out of ink years ago and you just find it in your junk drawer, something like that can be useful for scoring lines. Tweezers are also an indispensable tool. I've got this pair of tweezers that is my workhorse. for paper crafting, and it's got the angled edge that I use for bending glue tabs, folding things, of course holding things, applying pressure to glue joints, and then I also use the back of the tweezers to help me bend. So I'll put them up against my straight edge and run the back of the tweezers along to help me shape a bend. I do also use a second pair of tweezers that has a finer tip. That's not necessary, but I do find it helpful to manage smaller, more delicate pieces. You'll also want a ruler. You're going to actually need to make some measurements. As I mentioned, all of these nodes have internal supports, and for locating those internal supports, you're going to have to take some manual measurements and mark them. Almost all of the measurements I give are going to be in millimeters, so you'll want something that can measure millimeters. And then of course you'll also want a straight edge that you can use to help you make bends, to help you score long bend lines, and to help you cut. And my ruler has a great edge, so I just use my ruler as my straight edge. Not all rulers have great edges, so you want to find something that has a nice sharp edge. Some optional tools are a pair of scissors. You don't need a pair of scissors because you've got a knife. You can cut out everything you need with a knife, but a pair of scissors is useful for helping speed up some of the rough and larger cuts. The next optional tool will be a set of markers. And I use these to color in the glue tabs and the cut edges of the model, just so that it removes that bright white look and it helps them blend into the model more. It provides a nicer, more finished look for your model. Again, it's optional, not necessary to do, but it does make it look nicer. So I use the light gray a lot, just because it matches pretty closely to the color of the model. There's also black that I use, and then a yellow one for some of the cut edges around the tips of these nodes that have yellow. And then you can also use a dark gray on the body, but you could probably get away with a lighter gray on that. And lastly, you'll want something that's cylindrical in shape to help you roll some of the conical and cylindrical shapes as you're building the rings that go into the body. So I just like a pencil, or you could even just use the handle of your hobby knife, or you could use a handle of a paintbrush, anything like that to help you. Not necessary, but it is useful. Okay, a couple more notes before we wrap up here. This design evolved a little bit as I was working through filming these videos. This original model that I built, this is the prototype, and there were a few aspects to the model that were not easy to build, and were definitely not easy to explain how to build. And so as I was actually going through the build process to make these videos, I just decided that some of the ways I was building the model were not great, and so I redesigned a few things. So I only bring it up because there are a few points in the video where you might see versions of the parts that look different than the parts that you'll find in the PDF download. And that's just because during the filming process, I redesigned those and decided to do something better. So if you see any continuity errors like that, that's what's going on there. All right, lastly, let's talk about the foam ball and give you some more details on that. Like I said, the next video after this one, we start with prepping the foam ball to use in the model. But in that video, I didn't actually give enough explanation as to why the foam ball was necessary and even what size to use. So I do want to make sure that I cover that here. So the foam ball is in the model because this body is kind of a large, it's actually a complete sphere. You can't see it underneath the nodes here, but this is a complete sphere that you're going to build. And if it was hollow, it would not be strong enough to withstand the construction process. And so I really feel like it needs to be reinforced. And so I put this foam ball inside the body to give it strength, so that when you're gluing the nodes onto the body, you have to put some pressure on it to get the glue to bond. And I was just worried that without reinforcement, that sphere would collapse. Now the ball itself, this ball is it is sold as a nominal 2.5-inch diameter ball. So if you can find a 2.5-inch diameter ball, that's perfect. That's what you need. It actually measures a little bit smaller than that, at about 2.44 inches. And the reason that's important is that this model is scaled to fit that size of ball, this size of ball. So it's important to find a foam ball that's as close to this as you can get, right? So if you can find a ball that is sold as 2.5-inch diameter, I think you're good. That should work fine. Go ahead and get those. If you can't find something that is exactly that size, then it's not going to fit in the model as is. That doesn't mean you can't build the model, though. You could possibly scale the model up or down based on the size of ball that you get. By, instead of just printing it at full scale, you can adjust the scale at the time you print the model to be just a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. That is going to take some experimentation to get the right scale for whatever size ball you do end up finding. But it is possible to adjust that. Important note, though, if you are going to be scaling it, make sure you scale all of the sheets of parts. Don't just scale the sheet that has the sphere, the parts for the sphere, because if you don't also scale the parts for the node and the eye and everything else, then it's not going to fit together after you've built it all. They've all got to be scaled equally in order for that to work. Okay, I think that's it. Go ahead and go on to the next video where we start with the foam ball and building the body, and enjoy your build.